All right, today we are breaking down a really provocative and frankly kind of alarming thesis from Professor Jiang Xueqin. The idea here is that a war with Iran wouldn't just be another conflict overseas, but that it could actually trigger the collapse of the American empire as we know it. Now, this isn't just some wild claim. The source we're looking at lays out a very specific strategy, one that Iran has supposedly been working on for 2 decades. So let's walk through what that strategy actually is and what it could mean for, well, the entire global power structure. To really get our heads around this, it all boils down to 2 huge questions. First, how? How on earth could a regional power like Iran pull off something so massive against a superpower? And maybe even more puzzling, why would the United States ever walk into a trap that devastating? We're going to start with a how. Okay, so according to the source material, Iran has zero intention of fighting a classic war with tanks and jets. No way. The plan is a long, grinding war of attrition, one that's not designed to beat the U.S. military, but to bleed its economy completely dry. And this right here, this is the absolute key to the whole argument. It's not about fighting strength with strength. It's about finding the economic vulnerabilities that hold up America's power around the world. Finding those soft spots, and then just pushing and pushing and pushing. So where are these weak points? Well, the source argues they aren't even in the U.S. They're in its key allies in the Persian Gulf, places like Saudi Arabia and the UAE. The strategy is to go after the things that keep these countries alive: their energy, their water, and their food. And get this number, because it really shows you the chokehold we're talking about. 90%. That is how much food the Gulf states import through the Strait of Hormuz. That's a tiny waterway that Iran could easily threaten, cutting off the most basic thing people need to survive. And it doesn't stop with food. 60% of the fresh water in these desert nations comes from desalination plants. The source says these plants are just sitting ducks for cheap drone attacks. An attack like that could trigger a humanitarian crisis in a city like Riyadh in just a few weeks. So when you put all this together, it paints a pretty terrifying picture, right? The potential for disaster seems huge. Which leads to the big, obvious question. If the danger is so clear, why would this ever be allowed to happen? And what's really fascinating is that, according to the source, this wasn't some kind of secret. Apparently, top military leaders, we're talking the highest levels, knew how bad this could be and were basically shouting from the rooftops that it was a terrible idea. This is the real puzzle, isn't it? If the math is so bad and your own military experts are waving red flags, what could possibly be the reason to go ahead? Well, the source we're pulling from lays out 3 very different theories, and each one is more controversial than the last. All right, let's dive into these 3 potential explanations for why a leader might just ignore all those warnings and go for it anyway. So the source suggests it's not one simple thing, but maybe a mix of 3. First, there's imperial hubris, just pure overconfidence. Second, political calculus, which is a much colder look at personal gain. And third, something way more hidden and conspiratorial, called the esoteric factor. So, theory number 1 is just good old-fashioned arrogance. The source says this has happened all through history. Empires get so used to winning, they start to feel invincible. They think they can't lose, and that's when they make a huge, fatal mistake. The second theory is way more cynical. The idea here is that even if a war is a total disaster for the country, a leader could actually benefit personally. The source points to claims of big financial investments from allies and the fact that a president could use emergency war powers to mess with domestic politics. And now for the third one, and this is where things get, well, really out there. This is the most controversial claim by far. It's the idea that what happens in the world isn't random, that it's actually being directed by secret groups who are following a script to bring about some kind of end times scenario. And the source doesn't just leave it vague, it names names. It specifically alleges that these 3 groups make up this secret power structure. The claim is wild, that these societies control everything from the Vatican to U.S. national security and are pushing this conflict for their own secret agenda. Okay, let's put those theories aside for a minute and get back to the nuts and bolts of how this strategy could work. Because really, at its core, this is a war that's fought with spreadsheets and calculators, not with tanks and planes. I mean, just look at the math here. It is brutally simple, and it's completely unsustainable. For every $50,000 drone Iran sends up, the U.S. has to fire a missile that costs $1 million, maybe more, to shoot it down. You don't need to be a math genius to see that in a long war, that's a losing game. So here's the bottom line. The American military was built for the Cold War. It's designed to be the biggest, most expensive, most powerful force in the world. But in this scenario, it's like a heavyweight boxer trying to fight off a swarm of bees. It's all muscle, built for a completely different kind of fight, and it just drains resources. And all this brings us to the final and really devastating part of the argument. How does this all lead to a total collapse? Well, the source describes it as a cascade, a terrible domino effect. This slide lays out the chain reaction perfectly. First, these small asymmetric attacks create chaos in the Gulf states. That chaos threatens the flow of oil, which in turn could crash the petro-dollar system. That's the system that basically props up the US dollar worldwide. And if that system fails, the source argues, all the financial bubbles holding up the American economy just burst. And the final outcome described here is, well, it's nothing less than the end of an era. The collapse of the US economy would mean the end of its global dominance. It would create a totally new world order, with a bunch of different powers competing for the top spot. You know, the analysis we've just walked through is pretty chilling. It really forces you to ask a tough question about what power even means in the 21st century. What happens to an empire when the simple math of paying to stay on top just doesn't add up anymore? That's a heavy thought to leave you with.